Before we dig into using Trillion, I want to look at optimizing the memory on your computer. A lot of these sound sources take a lot of RAM up, and there's different ways of optimizing the resources you have. Now I'm going to open the patch browser here, and we'll load in a patch. And I'm going to go to our acoustic bases. We scroll through the browser here in the different categories and attributes. And I'm going to go to our acoustic bases. I'm going to choose Trillion Acoustic Base 1. And I'm going to choose the full range, which is a big sample set. And we see here it's 2,346 megabytes. We see here the memory bar, and there it's loaded in. Now you're thinking, gee, that's pretty quick. I can play it now. That's pretty good. It loaded all that really quickly. Well, there's lots of things going on behind the scenes that manage how this works. And we'll see here the memory meter shows that just a tiny little sliver of memory is being used for what's available. Now let's go to the system page and look at the settings. First of all, we can use the sample memory menu here to limit the amount of virtual memory Trillion uses. Now the default is process limit, but we can limit it to a specific number of gigabytes of virtual memory that it can use. I'm going to leave it at default. And if we have no limit on sample memory, it'll use whatever's available and you won't get any messages or error indications. But I'm going to leave it on process limit for now. Now here we see the amount of memory that's used. So 328 megabytes is used and 14,972 is available. So how come only 328 megabytes are being used if, in fact, this instrument uses up 2,346 megabytes? Good question. The reason is because I'm streaming the samples rather than loading them all into my RAM. So the rule of thumb is when running in 64-bit mode, which I am running now, I'm running Logic in OS 10.6 in 64-bit mode. When you're running in 64-bit mode, set the system memory setting to streaming so that it can access all the available RAM and virtual memory on your system. When you're running in 32-bit mode, there's a 3 to 4 gigabyte limitation, and that can be overridden by setting it to an option here where it says server. Now you're not seeing it here because I have the 64-bit version instantiated, but if I was running in 32-bit mode, there'd be a setting here called server mode, which allows the limitation of 3 to 4 gigabytes per application to be bypassed or surpassed, and it'll access memory outside of the application. The other alternative is to have not streamed mode, and I'm getting a message here, and that'll take a lot of time to load in the samples because it's going to load it all into RAM. And just for fun, I'll do it to show you. Let me click on this again, and there, it's going to start loading now, and you're going to see it's going to take a lot longer to load, and a lot more of this circle is going to be used up once it's done. While it's doing that, let's switch back here and we'll look at the other settings. We have preload memory size. Now, this determines how much of the sound source sample set is loaded into RAM versus how much is streamed from the hard drive. Higher values require more memory and they increase the load time. And when you switch this, you need to reload the sound source after changing the value. Now, we finished loading here, and you can see here that this yellow meter shows a lot more of the available memory has been used, and now 3,816 megabytes have been loaded into RAM. And if we go back to the browser here, you'll see a lot more of that circle is being used. Let's go back here, and I'm going to go back to streaming mode, and I'm going to have to reload the sample again. Let's go back. It'll reload much quicker because we're streaming the samples. There we go. And we'll go back to here, and we'll see it's running up back to 328 megabytes. Now, if I increase the preload time, I increased it a bit there. So let's keep our eye here. We have 328 megabytes being used. If I go back to here and reload the sample, there, it's loading. It's going to take a bit longer now, slightly longer. And if we go back to the system setting, we'll see that we now have 465 megabytes. By increasing the preload size, I've used more of the sound source sample set loaded into RAM versus streamed from the hard drive. Now, the number of bytes per read determines the size of each sample that's loaded into the memory versus being read from the hard drive. Now, I should say values here are usually set between about 22,000 and 66,000. Right now, it's at, 36,000, so it's right about in the middle. But that's the normal range, and for number of bytes, we usually leave it around the center. And again, that determines the size of each sample that's loaded into memory. Now, the lock memory, again, we also normally leave that on, determines if RAM is dedicated to holding the preload memory. Now, it should generally be left on, and the only time to really disable it is if you're running a lot of large applications together. And again, sound sources need to be reloaded when this is changed. So again, it determines how much RAM is dedicated to being used for the preload memory that's set over here. Next is the stream read ahead, and this is kind of like a look ahead function. It's a setting that's used so that fewer disk head movements are necessary when Trillian is reading samples from the hard drive, and it's generally a good idea to leave it on. Now, the stream break is probably the next most important to preload memory and how this all works. It balances the system resources between streaming and other operations that might be going on in your DAW. So low values are best at this. If the values are above 0.05, you might get glitching in your streaming because priority is being given to other operations that are happening in your DAW. And finally, we have a display over here. Now, the stream display, the leftmost number shows the number of streams that are in progress, and it normally is 0, but when I play a note, it'll jump up momentarily. And the middle number, or the middle value, shows the number of notes in progress. So you're wondering, how come it's showing 4 if I only hit one note? Because it includes velocity crossfades and release samples and other techniques like that that are built into the sound sources that use up the amount of voices. And the next rightmost number is the number of samples that are preloaded, and the number in brackets is the number of samples loaded when you're in not streamed mode over here. So this is always going to by default be 0 when I'm streaming, and when in the non-streamed mode, it'll show the amount loaded in. So there are other things you can do to optimize your memory. You can do things like sample thinning and use light mode and preview mode and things like that. We'll look at them all, but this is sort of the system level way of optimizing your memory usage.